I am just so pleased to be able to welcome you to Medgar College 2024 Social Work Conference. And Dr. Hernandez has already recognized Dr. Boone and the committee, but I want to recognize Dr. Boone again because he works so tirelessly all the time to make sure that when we have the conference, that we have the very best. And I was just so pleased when I heard how many people had registered, and I said, wow, we probably needed to have changed the venue, but again, please give a hand to Dr. Boone. And I always start out by saying Medgar College, birthed out of the Central Brooklyn community with social justice in its DNA, named for Medgar Wiley Evers, who gave his life for others to have rights, to be able to vote and to be able to go to a school of their choosing, someone who gave selflessly, and that is our mantra. And as an institution, we too are trying to live up to that image and legacy of Medgar Wiley Evers. We are a very special institution in that in 2023, after the last conference, and so I'm going to update you, we ranked in the top 50 in the nation of all institutions, all four-year institutions in the nation, for upward mobility for our students. And that's with us having students who came into our freshman class in 2023 with a median household income below $19,000 a year. And in spite of the families and the economics of the families that our students have, and in spite of the fact that Medgar College is a very under-resourced institution and has been since its founding, we still rise. And we want to continue to do all that we can as an institution to make sure that our students are successful, not just in their academics, but successful in life. I thank you all for being here. I heard about the CEU units, and so I know that you're going to pay close attention such that at the end of the conference, you will be able to get those units. So thank you so much, and have a great conference.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing space with us today. My name is Arlise, and I have the honor and the privilege of being your MC for today's conference. So we're going to start off by just talking about why are we here? What's the purpose of us being here? And it's to not only empower social workers, but we're going to be readjusting the lens of society through social work. So first, I'm going to touch upon trauma and how it's an emotional response to a negative event without appropriate support services and the life course. Emerging issues across healthcare delivery systems have demonstrated significant inequalities in all levels of quality and access to the resources for socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, people of color, people with disabilities, and women. And every person should have access to healthcare. Proactively addressing the expanding role of social workers and addressing the issues of the population's health, trauma-informed approaches to care for individuals, families, and groups, and communities that remain at the forefront of the World Health Agenda. And these are the key indicators that serve as a foundation for further exploration, intervention, and advocacy. And that's where social workers come into play. Today, we'll be hearing from multiple speakers and highlighting our panel discussions where we'll be talking about understanding the trauma across the life course, as well as understanding the unaddressed trauma, understanding the signs, symptoms, and impact of trauma among the formerly incarcerated, as well as the inequities in healthcare, the re-traumatization as an implication of healthcare service delivery. Now, with all that being said, we'll get started with our program for today. I have the honor to introduce our first speaker for today. Her name is Amaya Carter, and she is only an 8th grader. I can't even say only, but she's an 8th grader, currently attending Community Roots Charter School. Amaya's goals is to attend college after high school, where she can utilize her voice and talents within the areas of law, politics, and science. Amaya describes herself as young, motivated, and destined to be a change agent, and I see that from her bravery to come up today. She enjoys reading, and her latest read on the Posttraumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy has inspired her to present her thoughts on the presentation today. Please welcome in and welcoming Amaya.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to discuss a topic that is deeply rooted in the structure of our society, yet often overlooked. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, commonly referred to as PTSS. But what exactly is PTSS? In her enriching work, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. DeGruy, offers insights into the psychological, social, and economic structure that persists within the Black community and individuals well beyond the abolition of slavery. PTSS serves as a profound embodiment of the lasting imprints of historical trauma on the descendants of enslaved individuals. At its core, PTSS manifests with symptoms that mirror post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, including anxiety, decreased self-esteem, and depression. However, as we unpeel the layers of PTSS, we can uncover an ecosystem of intergenerational trauma, stigmatized socialization, and internalized racism. Racist socialization is an unpleasant experience wherein parents pass down their internalized beliefs about racism and race to their children. Now, passing down internalized beliefs is not exempt from any specific group of people, but today I'm specifically focusing on Black people. This transmission of ideologies keeps in existence of harmful stereotypes and negative perceptions of one's own culture and heritage. Children, influenced by the behaviors and language of their caregivers, internalize tainted ideas about their identity, continuing a cycle of self-doubt and oppression. Let me give an example of this. Everyone knows children are influenced by the behaviors and wordplay used around them. If a Black child is hearing white supremacist ideology, implicit and explicit bias all their life by their parents, then they start to repeat similar ideologies. Okay. These stigmatized ideas can include negative beliefs of one's own culture, heritage, tradition, how to handle discrimination, and even how to celebrate their own identity. I have seen this countless times amongst African American people and African people. Like when saying African people live in huts, are poor, etc. But overall, the message is that they are inferior, or how it was poked fun at that African Americans aren't close with their African heritage, and the experiences of racism and exploitation that we face here in America, which I never understood why this was a thing, because it seems like society dislikes both equally anyway. As the saying goes, they love our rhythm, but not our blues. All these stated examples open the door to internalized racism, which is when a white supremacist ideology or the racial hierarchy seeps into the mind of the affected individual about their own race. Personally, my favorite description of internalized racism is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. I deeply resonate with this quote because I can relate to it on a personal level. In or around the 3rd grade, my classmates and I began learning about slavery. I found myself in a puzzling situation during our discussions. My non-Black peers would often turn to me seeking my thoughts on the topic. Internally, I felt confused and uncertain. I questioned why they singled me out on my opinions on a subject that everyone should have views on. And I struggled to articulate my own views. This sudden attention felt unsettling, especially considered that I enjoy attention. It brought back to light a division between the non-Black and Black children in my class that I haven't previously noticed. Previously, I saw my classmates and myself as equals, but this experience left me feeling alienated and inferior. It was a disappointing realization that stirred up my feelings of envy and isolation, causing me to grow distant from the friends I had grown to love. Truthfully, I'm unsure if I distanced myself from them or if it was the other way around. But what I do know is that I didn't feel like I can be my true, authentic self around them. It was a degrading experience. Later, I confided in my mom, overwhelmed with anger and feelings of being looked down upon. I felt different, isolated, and increasingly alone. Despite having many friends, I couldn't shake the sense of the social imbalance, especially in a school where I was the minority and lacked reliability with my peers. Growing up with a vast majority of friends being people of non-color meant that I was naturally influenced by their perspectives. One early encounter with internalized racism stands out to me. I showed my mom a character in a game called Roblox. She noticed that my character was white. With a puzzled look on her face, she questioned why my character was white. I responded, because white people make more friends and people are nicer to me now. Reflecting on that moment, I can only imagine how my mom must have felt, but I never asked. I rarely discussed this experience unless asked. I didn't seek pity. I simply desired to feel equal once more. Moving on to another example. This will be the last one, I promise, okay? Many of us are familiar with the common phrases, good hair, nappy-headed, bald-headed. This is something else I can personally relate to concerning my own hair. From an early age, I've held on to insecurities about my hair. These insecurities surfaced as I observed that my hair wasn't as desired as my classmates' straight or wavy hair. I vividly recall an instance where my mom styled my natural hair into pigtails. I felt like all eyes were on me, scrutinizing and judging. Throughout the day, I wore a hat and frequently visited the school bathroom to gaze into the mirror, desperately seeking something to appreciate about my misunderstood hair. Yet, all I found was a group of my peers pressuring me to remove my hat. When I took off my hat, everyone told me it doesn't look bad. I don't understand why you're hiding it, which made me feel better, but also worse, because they would never understand how it felt. Surprisingly, most of the scrutiny about my hair from my Black peers came from my Black peers rather than the white ones I expected. Even today, I still encounter similar challenges, feeling compelled to conform to societal expectations regarding my hair. However, I've learned to embrace my hair as it is, understanding that I don't need validation from anyone but myself. For many of us, our experiences carry profound personal significance. These experiences often leave us feeling isolated and disconnected, struggling with the sense of being different that alters our interactions with others. Rooted in a history of systemic oppression and dehumanization, these experiences continue to influence how we view ourselves and those around us. Furthermore, PTSS manifests in countless ways, including perceptions of beauty and self-worth. Dr. DeGroot experiences with hair discrimination stress the common influence of societal standards of beauty and the pressure to conform. Despite external validation, internalized racism keeps feelings of insecurity and deficiency, forcing individuals to struggle with their sense of identity and belonging. In conclusion, PTSS is a continuous reminder of the long suffering of slavery and its impact on the psyche of individuals and communities. By acknowledging and confronting the root causes of PTSS, we as people can begin to take apart long-established systems of oppression and pave the way for healing and collective liberation. Together, let us strive to create a society where every individual is valued and celebrated for who they are, free from the shackles of historical trauma and systematic injustice. As Nelson Mandela would say, for to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Before closing out, I would like to thank everyone for allowing me to share my experiences in such an open environment full of social workers, mental providers, and other professionals, along with my family, friends, and loved ones. I would like to give a special shout out to my mother for encouraging me and supporting me throughout this journey. I love you, Mommy. And a special thanks, to Dr. Waleed Boone for allowing me this opportunity and platform to express my inner thoughts. I will forever remember this day and all of you. With that being said, I would encourage you all to read this book, Posttraumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. DeGroot. And remember, broken crayons can still color. Happy Women's and Social History Month.
Thank you so much, Amaya. Can we have another round of applause for Amaya? That was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Amaya. Your honesty and your courage to come up here and present is very inspiring. Appreciate you. Next up, please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Sullivan. She comes to us today with a background and key experiences in government, city, and state agencies, with a wealth of experience in the healthcare leadership, education, policy, planning, and program development. She's previously held positions in the health and hospital system as the executive director, the deputy commissioner of the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, at St. Barnabas Hospital, as well as past president of the NASW New York City chapter. And she currently still wears a lot of hats as the executive director of Creedmoor Psychiatric Center, as a fellow of the New York State Academy of Medicine, as well as one of the chair and the advisory boards of the Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Center in Harlem. She's also the founder and CEO of the Citywide Behavioral Health Coalition for Black Elders. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Martha Sullivan.
So you have selected a very important topic this morning, and I really commend you for it. And the theme of readjusting society, the lens of society through social work, is a beautiful theme. Would be wonderful if social work could simply just do that, right? Because we're the ones who are positioned to do so well. Today I'm going to speak to you primarily from the Black experience, which is my experience. However, note that those of other oppressed groups may find that much of what we talk about applies to your experience as well. And so you may want to think about that as we proceed. Let's get started by placing racial trauma in context. It's the context of a people who, despite racial trauma, we have experienced, the racial trauma that we have experienced, both individually and collectively, we are a resilient people who have survived. Yes, we're going to discuss the wounds and scars that historical and continuing collective trauma has left. There's no denying that. And we need not deny, because we need to be intentional and deliberate to heal from all of those scars and wounds. But we are here today to have this very discussion because of the resilience of our people. And I think it's important to note that, right? Here we are in a room full of Black professionals, educated. We all know that education was vehemently denied, right? And even the opportunity to get a college education is not something that we've had very long. In fact, I'll ask for a show of hands, how many of you are the first college-educated person in your family? Okay, that's about half of the room, about half of the room. So I also will give this caveat. Oh, I'm glad to see that screen over there. I am not a historian. There are historians who have and would add very much more to this picture here. But consider it a pictorial outline of a great people who then experienced unfathomable oppression for generations. People who were traveling the world from the motherland, who went to visit other continents, seeing parts of the world that others didn't know existed, and mapping the cosmos. Some of whom were later enslaved, others were colonized, brought to varying degrees of disrespect, dehumanization, and torture. Yet, as a people, they have risen, scars and traumas and all, to great heights. So we're a resilient people. And without being overly romantic, we built great ancient societies with scientific achievements, some of which are still not fully understood. We traveled to the Americas from the motherland centuries before Columbus, and yet endured colonization, which some would argue continues today via economic methods. We endured capture, the Middle Passage, the tortures of degradation and enslavement as chattel. And I point out the enslavement as chattel because I'm sure many of you have heard, we were sold into slavery by our own people. You've heard that, right? The thing is that the people who sold us into slavery had no concept of what was ahead of us. It wasn't there. That was not their understanding of slavery. And their understanding of slavery was more like indentured servitude. You could work your way out. It wasn't a lifelong. Later, of course, we know that then we were determined to be 3/5 of a person. And even that, the intent was not to recognize our humanity. It was the intent to give the owners, if you will, more political power with their vote. But although many were lost, many also survived the Middle Passage. And just a word about the Middle Passage. I think some of you may have read that the actual path that sharks take through the ocean was permanently changed after the Middle Passage. And quite frankly, it just brings tears to my eyes every time I think about that. I almost feel like we should stop and pray. But the point is that many people either jumped from the ships or were thrown over, that it changed the pattern. So, the point here is that it's important for us to be able to hold these two phenomena in our consciousness at the same time, because that's the complexity of the experience that we have had, right? It's not only the scars and wounds, but they certainly are deep. We've been through a lot. At the very same time, we have been very resilient and accomplished all the things that are reflected in this room today. So what promotes resilience? Really, all three of these could be summed up in terms of social connectedness. We are a people that thrives on being connected to others. Now, one might say that that's important for all human beings, which it is. Social isolation is not good for anyone. But part of our heritage is that connectedness is extremely important to us. I think about, if any of you, for example, since a lot of my work has been with older adults and geriatrics, if you think about having a home attendant, right? Having a home attendant. Has anyone had the experience of a family member with a home attendant? So when it works best, the home attendant becomes part of the family, right? Or we all have friends who then become family, to the point that sometimes the kids think that so-and-so is a blood aunt or uncle, right? Because that's the way we do it, right? And that helps us. That's extremely important to us. Family support, extremely important. Much of what we learn about how to cope with those scars and wounds, we learn in our family, right? But also it's in the family that we get validation. We need that validation that we may not be experiencing as we move in the larger world. And a strong ethnic identity. Studies are actually beginning to show that a strong ethnic identity actually can serve as a buffer for the severity of racial trauma. right? So knowing who you are, right? Being proud of who you are can ease, I guess is the word, the severity of racial trauma. So that's very, very important. And that makes me think of the Black is Beautiful movement. So I'm going to take a risk here. How many of you were alive when the Black is Beautiful movement began? You can raise, you don't have to be ashamed, raise your hands a little high. Okay, all right. So, I think to people external to the community, they might have thought, well, that's a nice thing. Isn't that nice, right? I think that was critical for us. And if you recall, when did we discover this Black is Beautiful? Well, let me retract that, because I don't think we discovered being beautiful at that point. Within our own circles, we did have our own aesthetic and we appreciated our beauty. But we were constantly met with the fact that, first of all, we had no culture and we had no history. And when we discovered our culture and our history and began to embrace our connection to the motherland, that's when the Black is Beautiful emerged, right? And so the Black is Beautiful movement, I think, was not only the internal embracing, which it did support, but we were embracing it in a way that kind of we wanted to shout it, right? We wanted to say to the world, this is our aesthetic. This is what we believe is beautiful, and it's us. I'm thinking maybe, and you'll tell me, maybe the Black girl magic is kind of the Black is Beautiful of today. So then we move to racism. If we're going to talk about racial trauma, we need to talk about racism. So I know this group knows what racism is. You know it's about organized systems within societies that cause avoidable and unfair inequalities in power, resources, and capacities. You know that. You know that it can be internalized, and Amaya, I don't need to say much more about that. Amaya gave beautiful examples in her talk of internalized oppression. Some would argue that it's the worst, right? Because with internalized oppression, the oppressor has actually helped us to do their work for them on ourselves and others, right? And I think it's probably inescapable to have some, because the environment that we live in is such a racist environment, right? It's hard to escape some of it. So maybe forgiveness is another thing we can talk about at another time, self-forgiveness. Interpersonal racism. Well, I think interpersonal racism is what people think about all the time, right? They think it's only someone who's a bad person doing bad things to people of color. Well, it is that, but it's not only that. And then systemic. And again, I think this is a group that also knows what systemic racism is about. It's about how the institutions and organizations are organized in such a way to favor some groups or disfavor others. Ken Hardy, this is a quote from him, who says, "For people of color, racial oppression is a life sentence to a wall-less prison in which all aspects of one's being are affected. It encroaches on the freedom of people of color by prescribing and demanding how they should live, especially if they wish to be accepted within the broader white society." And the reality is, while we have our, let's say, special places like this, our churches, we have to also learn to move in the larger society, right? Just to manage. There's more I could say about that too, but for another day. I do want to just give you some data that there's a study that has shown that amongst people of color, African Americans, discrimination experience is more pervasive than even non-Hispanic whites experience. They would say that they've experienced discrimination in this particular study 11% of the time. but 81% of the people of color said I've experienced discrimination. 81% versus 11%. And I would suspect that the other, 19%, probably didn't recognize it when it was happening, right? They didn't know what it was. There's some things that the psyche just finds too hard, right? It's just too difficult. You think about the extremes like car accidents, right? When terrible car accidents and the victims have no memory of what happened, which is probably very protective because it was just that traumatic, right? So the psyche just tossed it out and said, I can't deal with that. So perhaps less than a car accident, but these other, maybe we could even metaphorically refer to them as minor car accidents that happen with trauma. And racial trauma is simply race-based. It's born out of a racial situation or racial experience. So an individual or group's stressful, painful reaction to racial discrimination, which is the direct experience of, so it's the direct experience of it happened to you, or you witnessed it, or you learn about it. Sometimes hearing about someone else's trauma is traumatizing. And I think we've experienced that, yes? I like to hear from folks if you have. Or just the threat of harm to an individual based on their race. Now, because the study and the discourse about racial trauma is rather new, you see what you often see with new concepts, that in the beginning, the terminology is not standardized yet, right? So the list there on the left are the various titles that you might see as you read about it that are all referring to the same thing. They might call it race-related stress, or racism-related stress, or race-based stress, race-based traumatic stress, societal trauma, insidious trauma, intergenerational trauma, race incident-based trauma, or psychological racism. All of that is referring to racial trauma. But it is a severe mental and emotional injury caused by the cumulative traumatic effect of racism experienced throughout life. And I think that's an issue that we're going to return to, the fact that it can be cumulative. So just as racism can be systemic, so can racial trauma, right? So those same policies, those ways that institutions are organized to promote certain behaviors can all support and encourage racial trauma. It can be vicarious. So I just really alluded to that, right? You hear about someone else's trauma, and it can be traumatizing to you. And since for us as a people, it's hard to escape having experienced racial trauma, we're hearing about other traumas as traumatized people ourselves, right? So that compounds the situation. And then historical trauma. So that has to do with major events, policies, or treatment of specific groups that negatively impacts subsequent generations of those groups. Amaya spoke about that very beautifully, too. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, can you go back to that slide? I'm sorry. I think this is a very important quote, so I'll take a minute to read it. The trauma of enslavement was so severe that it implanted a psychological and social shock in the minds of Black people. Current generations still carry the scars mentally and socially. And I think that's something that the larger community does not want to accept. And maybe some of us don't want to either, right? We all think that as individuals, we worked hard and we got here because we did what needed to be done. That is partly true. If you don't work hard, you're probably not going to have the same outcome. But there is an intergenerational transmission of symptoms and also of good things, right? So we're not as self-made individuals as we might like to think. And in addition to knowing that this is the history of Black people in America, the systemic racism that has remained in place since the end of slavery has resulted in ongoing racial trauma and injustices to Black people, including, but not limited to, racial profiling, voter suppression. We know something about voter suppression as a contemporary problem, and overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. So enduring constant prejudice, discrimination, and bias takes a toll on one's mental health. So, I think it's analogous to what we often want to help people to understand in therapy, right? Because, you'll have a client that really wants to talk about the past and what happened to them, and maybe sometimes it's difficult to move them to the present. Or you'll have a client who is really about the present but doesn't want to explore the past. And, I think both obviously are important. And the issue is, in this case, now I'm moving away from the therapy room, the present is not racism-free, right? So the present is still supporting and really organized, I think we could say, around some of the same beliefs about Black people that the past was. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The larger community understood later on 9/11 that constant, those constant images of the attack on the World Trade Center was not a good thing, right? We all remember where we were that day. We know what we went through. And in my case, me and my husband were all working in Lower Manhattan at that time. And fortunately, we were both safe. It was hairy. And then we ultimately, we helped, because I was working at the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene at the time. We both helped out there. And maybe something to share with you with regard to that, because it does make the point about trauma. At that time, in the Department of Health, in the lobby, the health care workers, because many of the people in government have policy positions, but they're trained healthcare workers. And they went to work and they transformed the lobby of 125 Worth Street into a clinic. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. I'm in that lobby all the time and it's transformed. I'm also a trained family systems therapist, and I happen to have met along the way another staff person at DOH who was also a trained family systems person. So we were both kind of like, what are we doing here? Is he was working in some, other area. So long story short, we come down to join the people in the lobby, and we said, well, we're the mental health folks. We can help people with the mental health issues. People were a little like scratching their head. Well, what do we do with them? We're building here for the fractures and the first aid and all of that. So they said, well, maybe the two of you can go down there at the end of the hall. We said, that's perfect, because we need the confidentiality, we need the quiet, so we go down there. Long story short, who do you think had all the business? Everyone who walked in was traumatized. All right, and I don't want to be flippant about business. What I really just mean to say is that everyone who walked in had to come to see us. And we know why that was. So, we began, the general population began to learn a lot about trauma after that. But then you see these images, and I know everybody's seen this before. George Floyd, Eric Garner, and there's a million others, right? These images are traumatic for us, right? I often think also, what about their families, right? What about their families when these images keep being shown? in the media. And what's also special about this for us is when I talked about that social connection, there's a feeling associated with these images for us, is it not? Because we know that could be our brother. That could be our uncle. In fact, I'm going to ask, if you would, for a show of hands, how many of you have personally experienced violence? Let's say in this case, it's the hand of the police, or someone, a close friend or family member has experienced it. Okay, again, that's more than half of the room, right? So when we see those images, they are more traumatizing because they hit home. And even if you haven't experienced it and you're raising a child, male or female, it still touches you, right? Because you're worried that they will experience something like that. So the recurring trauma is an issue. So we know that microaggressions are brief, they're commonplace, daily verbal and behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. That's important because for someone to say, well, I didn't intend that, that's good. You know, that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt you though, right? It doesn't mean you're not going to suffer the impact of it. And they really do communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults that potentially have a harmful and unpleasant psychological impact on the target. Going back again to Amaya's situation, that's why she was so right in saying that her other classmates should have had an interest in this topic as well. Because if you're being responsible and you want to be an anti-racist person, you want to learn about these microaggressions. You want to learn about what they're based on because you want to avoid doing that, right? It's not just the purview of the people who are receiving it. So the health impact and the mental health impacts. Infant mortality, we know that we have a huge problem of infant mortality. Within the first year, if you look at 1,000 births, 4.8 of white infants compared to 11.7 of Black infants die. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to have a pregnancy-related death than white women. The life expectancy for Black people is 77 years, but for whites it's 80.6. Black women it's 79.8 years, and Black men 74 years. Hypertension, I think we all know, is known to be related also to stress, right? By the way, although I did say, and I will continue to focus, I'll be focusing largely on the Black community. I think you all may know that with regard to immigrant communities, we're beginning to see that their health is actually better before they come to the States. It's when they come to the States that the health declines. And that tends to make the point, right, about the stress and the impact of stress on health. Mental health impact, it's the severity and the persistence of the mental health problems that seems to be the impact for us. Now, we also, I think everyone knows, we're really seeing a sharp increase of Black youth suicide. Very sad, and we don't fully understand all of the reasons for that yet. Since this increase is overlapping with the pandemic, some think that contributed to it, and in that case, it probably is not just the pandemic itself, but the pandemic impact was far-reaching, right? It's the social isolation for young people. It's also what's going on in the family when the family is all shut up at home and in economic factors. So we don't fully understand it, and it's obviously very concerning. I do want to say, to make it clear, there is nothing inherent about being Black that makes you more prone to mental health problems. So let's be clear about that, right? And if you want to read more about that, one place I would suggest is the Surgeon General's report called Mental Health. Dr. David Satcher, our Surgeon General, gave us the first Surgeon General's report on mental health, and the mental health community was so happy. And he made that point there that the issue is that we are overrepresented in vulnerable populations, and that makes us more prone to stressors and therefore mental health problems. Next slide, please. So everyone knows about Henrietta Lacks, right? And we certainly know about the Tuskegee experiment. The only things that I would point out here that sometimes people don't know or may not think about, the cells that were retained from Henrietta Lacks have made billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. Her family got none of that. Now, someone might have an update, because the last I knew was a couple of years ago, and, I'm running out of time, that the family was organizing and ready to take some action. I don't know how that worked out. But they were a struggling, everyday family. And here, the medical field was making billions of dollars off of cells they took from their relative without her permission or anybody's permission. So does that resonate back to what we said before about being chattel, being property, right? You could do anything you want with an object. You don't have to get permission, right? With Tuskegee, I think some of the salient points there, of course, it's atrocious just what they did, but some of the salient things to think about in terms of access, these men were going for treatment. They were seeking treatment and believing that they were getting it, right? And also, numbers of their wives died from syphilis because, of course, it's a transmissible disease. And I want to say the number might be like 43 of the wives died. I'm not, do you have the number?
Doesn't syphilis come from the previous when you have sex?
I believe so. So they were married. Yeah, they were married. And there was a control group of people in that population that were known not to have syphilis. I'm going to call them researchers because I don't want to call them health professionals, actually prevented the people who were in this study from getting health care anywhere else, right? They went and spoke to the other healthcare folks in the community and got them to agree to not treat these people. So, I mean, you could do a whole session on that, but it's just important to mention. So, the inequities that we still see today have to do with diagnosis and assessment. And jumping ahead a little bit, but I see I'm running out of time. We don't have, I talked earlier about the nomenclature and the terminology for racial trauma. It's not in the DSM, right? And I would also challenge us to think about how often do we see references to racial trauma or oppression on a treatment plan or a service plan, right? Honestly, I think we have a long way to go, even if we just step back to cultural competence, which we all say is a good thing. Find the service plan or treatment plan that actually references something that you ask the patient or client about in terms of their culture, right? And then we wonder why the patients say, well, they asked me all these questions, but I don't know, right? Because we don't tie it together for them. We don't make sense of why we asked what we did. Next slide, please. So the impact of racial trauma on providers. I mentioned earlier, some of us, we're carrying our own traumas, then we're helping people who are traumatized. So we're at risk for secondary trauma. And we're also providing services, as I said, for traumatized individuals with our own history of trauma. We have those media images that may be occurring. And this may also ultimately have an impact in our personal relationships. And I'm going to just speed here for a minute. Let's go to the next slide. To the helping relationship. So what we want to guard against is microaggressions entering into the helping relationship, right? Because all of those impacts that we talk about, how we feel, that's how patients or clients feel when microaggressions happen. Here you come to a helping relationship as a client. You're vulnerable. You're sort of wide open. You're seeking help, and then you get one of those slings or arrows from the person that's helping you, right? This can contribute to poor outcomes in the therapy, because the working alliance is now impacted by the microaggressions. So it also can contribute, of course, to patients withdrawing. One of the things that happens when patients withdraw is we don't find out why. We don't know why. Sometimes it's not for a negative reason. Sometimes they actually do feel they got the help that they needed and they didn't need to go any further, but we don't always know that. But some studies have shown, one study showed that most people in a counseling or helping relationship have experienced at least one microaggression during the helping process. So it's not a good thing. And taking a stance of cultural humility is what can help, right? So stance of cultural humility, meaning that we as the provider of service, as the therapist, the counselor, the worker, are very open to learning, right? We are curious, and we are then taught and led by the patient about their culture and their experience, rather than moving too quickly to impose our own thoughts. Next slide, please. So I said that we would end by, well, what can we do to promote that resilience? Because that's about promoting wellness as well, right? So of course, culturally appropriate care, there are clinic services, private services. I'm happy to say that I'm pleased about the way that our community is taking advantage of mental health care now, talking about mental health care. This is such a good thing. And I always remind people that you have access to private psychotherapy. Sometimes we don't even think that health insurance we have allows us to access private psychotherapy. And there are not enough, but there are increasingly more and more private clinicians, Black clinicians, that one can access. I will say, I have a very small private practice. When I started my private practice, let's just say many moons ago, it was 90% white. It's now 90% Black. And it has been 90% Black for a long time now. It's a good thing. It's a really good thing. The validation and connection I talked about before, this middle picture is actually my family reunion. During the pandemic, we had to have it virtually. So those family reunions is another way of helping yourself, your children know that they have support. They come from someplace. They have a history. They have a culture, and they are connected to people. And it restores dignity and pride. Worship settings. I mean, I don't think I have to say much about how important that is, right, for restoring pride and a sense of self-worth. The people who maybe were on the low end of the totem pole all week at the job they're up on the altar, on the sanctuary. They're running ministries and all on Sunday, right? So that validation is there. And the last picture there, protest and advocacy, right? That says, you know, you are important, you are worthy, and you are demanding and seeking to have what you should have in life. Next slide, please. So this really kind of sums that up again, the systems of spirituality, systems that promote community belongingness, advocacy, self-sacrifice. That's something that we don't talk about that much, right? But it actually is part of our tradition. So you think about your namesake here, Medgar Evers. He was assassinated for doing the work that he was doing, right? Many of our leaders, it's about sacrifice, and not only those that are the names that we know who, were assassinated perhaps, but think about just the people you know every day, the people running those ministries, right, who sacrifice time, extend themselves to promote wellness in the community. All right, now I'm getting a different look, so I'm going to really wrap up. If we can go to the next slide. What you as clinicians can do, there are now instruments coming out that will help you to actually begin to measure racial trauma. So those bear a looking at. And obviously assess racial trauma, ask about it early in treatment, create an environment where there's freedom to talk about these issues early in treatment, and do some self-of-the-therapist work to become a racially sensitive, trauma-informed therapist. You know, there was a time that it was just assumed that if you were going to work with people, you need to do some work on yourself first. And we don't hear about that so much anymore, but maybe we need to return to that. Next slide, please. So with that, this is just a smattering. The background there is a fuller reference, but I brought to the foreground some things that you definitely want to see. I'm sure we all know about Joy DeGruy's work, and Amana, I forgot your name already, but Amaya, thank you, talked about it so well. Again, I would say anything that Ken Hardy wrote, read it. Anything Nancy Boyd Franklin wrote, read it. Elaine Penderhugh's work is older, but it's a classic. I really suggest it. She's a social worker. Nancy's a psychologist. What's Ken's discipline? Is he a psychologist, I think? Or social worker? I'm not remembering exactly. But with that, last slide. Thank you very much. Happy Social Work Month.